Hey all, it's Ryder, and I hope you do someone else a favor without asking for anything in return. Before the video begins, I want to thank everyone for helping us reach 1,000 subscribers. You are all too incredible, and interacting with the community is the highlight of my day. If you haven't already, subscribing to the channel helps us reach more players to better the ESO PvP community for everyone. On another note, I opened up my Discord to the community. The link will be in the description below. I'm currently compiling a list of builds to review, so if you'd like to have your build featured in a video, join the Discord and post it. Onto the video. We'll dig even further than we have before and discuss weapon traits. There's been a popular consensus of what is best for a long time, but these claims have always been a bit misleading and dismiss viable creativity within build diversity. Weapon traits aren't something to be dismissed, but I often see many builds carelessly tossing on a weapon with a trait that doesn't make sense for the build. As such, it's time we discuss which traits will work best for your build. For each trait, I'll provide a brief summary of its tooltip, explain how to employ it effectively, and discuss how subclassing alter our approach to these traits. Each section is separated, and while I offer discussion into each one, when creating your own build, use this video as a series of references so you may perform calculations yourself, such as weighing the use of Nirnhoned versus Sharpened. Starting with Charged, this trait increases our status effect chance by 235%, but without context, this value doesn't mean anything. To begin, we'll cover status effects. Status effects, as displayed on the screen, come in many forms and have secondary effects tied to them. Some status effects deal direct damage, while others leaves dots or debuffs on the target. The type of damage required to activate a status effect varies, such as disease damage activating the Minor Defile status effect, and physical damage proccing Sundering. All direct damage abilities, like Templar's Jabs, have a 10% chance to activate their status effect, while damage over times have a 3% chance to activate. There are champion point passives and skill lines like Herald of the Tome that increase the damage and frequency of status effects, so if this interests you, I recommend pausing the video to do some digging. On the UESP build editor, they've provided the calculation for a status effect chance as seen on screen. By adding Charge to a two-handed weapon, the base chance for a direct damage ability jumps from 10% up to 33%, and dots now have a 10% chance to activate as well. Some abilities have additional chances to activate their effects as well, as Pelican discussed in his video. To lightly summarize his perspective, the Sundering status effect can be exploited by using Charged, as Sundering provides an additional direct damage splat, greatly boosting the damage of jabs. If you'd like to see how this operates in practice, refer to both his video, linked in the description, and my own take on this, linked just below that one. Because status effects can apply a lot of additional damage to a spammable, the concept can be applied to the Destruction Staff's Force Pulse. The ability uses 3 damage types, meaning each has a chance to apply their respective status effect. Not only does adding Charged mean the status effects have a longer uptime, but also they consistently add damage ticks that could easily surpass other traits like Nirnhoned or Sharpened when built correctly. Force Pulse also has the additional effect to cleave opponents already marked with a status effect, meaning this single target spammable can now consistently do AoE damage with the Charged trait. When considering if to use this trait or not, you should weigh the choices of glyphs to run with this. To optimize a build using Charged, use any of the damage types that offer debuff not naturally found within your build. For example, I recommend running Disease for the chance at applying Defile to the enemy, but other options could include Flame to place a 4-second burning dot or Shock to apply minor vulnerability. While this trait is certainly strong, it isn't usable on many builds. With the inclusion of Elemental Susceptibility, 3 status effects are naturally applied at all times, given status effects last 4 seconds and LSS resupplies them at a matched frequency. Some abilities also guarantee status effects like Surprise Attack, Blood for Blood, and Blast Bones. So Charged wouldn't directly add to these spammables damage, thus lowering your potential damage output. To summarize, Charged is exceptionally strong, so long as your abilities can activate useful statuses and your build does not have guaranteed ways of reapplying them. The trait can maintain crucial debuffs in a fight and even add more damage than some of the traditional traits. This is absolutely a strong choice that more players should consider to optimize. Decisive is a trait that generates more ultimate anytime ultimate is restored, and while the randomness of the trait activating might be appealing to some, you may be convinced that this is actually one of the strongest options. Before I go further, it's important to note that the Decisive trait operates differently from two-hand to dual-wield. On a two-handed weapon, the user has a 50% chance to gain 1 ultimate, but on the dual-wield, who have 2 instances of 25% chance to generate 1 ultimate, effectively meaning 50% chance for 2 ultimate. This is an interesting interaction that I won't cover necessarily, but it's important to note in case you wanted to run this. For any build that naturally generates small amounts of ultimate at a time, Decisive can transform from a mediocre trait to especially strong. Buffs such as Major and Minor Heroism, which are accessible through many means, add a fair amount of ultimate on their own, and you can view Decisive as an addition onto this. Usually, Minor Heroism provides 1 ultimate every 1.5 seconds or 0.66 ultimate per second. If we have a 2-handed weapon, this value jumps to an average of 0.83 ultimate per second, and 1.0 ultimate if using dual wield. One of the best uses for this build is to use it with abilities that generate unique returns to ultimate, such as Vampire's Exhilarating Drain, Necromancer's Bitter Harvest, and Warden's Shimmering Shield, as well as some other options. Some skill lines like Animal Companions and Dawn's Wrath also generate ultimate occasionally, so these should be considered when choosing whether or not to run Decisive. I won't go into the math of percentage increases of ultimate gained per ability, but the values are often underrated in my opinion. If you'd like to see how this trait can be maximized, I actually made a build that revolved around the dual wield Decisive, linked into the description. I was able to pump barriers out every 8 to 11 seconds if I focused on it, and if this interests you, I recommend you make the build with this mindset. As mentioned, the trait is best used with low ultimate generating effects and loses values with higher bursts of ultimate gain, such as Nightblade's Siphoning passive and the Arcasis set. But in cases where these are employed, I would assume that the player wants to generate as much ultimate as possible anyway, so I'm not going to go into these exceptions. Builds that don't have any explicit gain of ultimate should avoid using Decisive. Although every build generates ultimate based on a light or heavy attack, this trait alone would be wasted. To apply this to the current meta, the most commonly run mythic, the Monomyth, provides minor timidity while on the back bar. From personal experience, I run 1 Decisive, and this seems to mostly negate this negative effect, which minimizes one of the ring's drawbacks. If this debuff specifically turned you away from the item, consider running Decisive on the back bar to correct this. One pairing that should also be considered is a Mechanical Acuity with the Decisive trait. For those unaware, Mechanical Acuity is a set that guarantees critical strikes, but goes on a long cooldown. Lining up our ultimate to be ready with Mechanical Acuity can be really difficult sometimes, so I find that running Decisive on the back bar will not only correct the minor timidity given by the Monomyth, but will also let me line up my ultimate faster with my Acuity, because if we have Acuity active and our ult isn't, we're basically having to wait for our ultimate to be ready anyway, which can cost us another 30 seconds. In summary, Decisive is a really strong trait if you have additional gains of ultimate such as Heroism or other abilities or sets. I would not advise running this offensively, but can be a massively underrated backbar trait to allow more frequent bursts and helps you line up your Acuity with ultimate timers. Defending gives the armor equivalent of 5% damage mitigation if used on a 2-handed weapon, and half this if used on a 1-handed weapon. Because players stack into penetration, the diminishing returns from these values are negligible, and for the sake of conversation, will not be considered when weighing the effectiveness of this trait. Because the trait adds mitigation, this, in turn, creates a few beneficial effects outside of the tooltip. To start, Defending increases the time it takes for an enemy to reach your execute and prevents death from bursts. The trait especially shines in any outnumbered scenario where incoming damage far exceeds a similar boost to healing. For this reason alone, it's hard to find many 1vXers that run anything but a defending ice staff to maximize the defensive bonuses. With the release of subclassing, the time to kill has greatly decreased and bursts can potentially one-shot you if your mitigations are not properly accounted for. With this high damage, we must rely on more defensives to prevent our death, and the defending trait gives way to the single best mitigation trait currently accessible in ESO. While other options like Powered might supply similar reinforcements to your survivability, because damage is so high, healing is less desirable, and in its place, mitigations rise above. In future patches, if the time to kill is extended, Powered might make a return, but more on that later. Unlike some choices on this list, the defending trait is always useful, and while it might not provide as much power as a build optimizing one of the other traits, this doesn't mean defending is lacking any power in comparison. In my opinion, defending not only boasts high degrees of versatility, but it's also very strong, if not the strongest defensive bonus to add onto a build. Some specialized builds, like a bash build, also rely on high armor to achieve their win condition. Players might be convinced to run this on the front bar to increase the duration of their offensive window, but this is not ideal. To explain, your build must include a clear path to win condition, and trading the strength of your offense for defense is not a good idea in ESO's PvP. If you're curious as to what this means, I recommend you watch this video shown on your screen, as my next points rely on this for context. If you trade the strength of your offense to instead extend the window, you transform your build into something that can easily kill lower skilled players, but you'll have a difficulty defeating stronger opponents. Giving up your damage to survive longer will not lead you to your win condition, but instead grants your opponents more chances to meet theirs. The charts on your screen demonstrate this point, with the x-axis representing a timeline and the y-axis displaying the effective damage output. As shown, the top image has a longer window to be aggressive, and this is because the build assumes defending on the front bar, as well as other choices that lead to a more defensive style. The bottom chart, however, is more optimal, as it trades the duration for the window for potency, thus allowing a more skilled player to secure kills faster and more often. For newer players, they might be tempted to align themselves with the first option, as lining up abilities may be difficult. Because my videos are tailored for almost everybody, I wouldn't entirely discount this as being an option, especially in the high damage meta. That said, as you become more skilled and are familiar with PvP, try changing your build to more closely match the bottom chart. To explain why, let's detour to a tangent that discusses damage fishing. Boiled down to its basics, many skilled players can anticipate and correctly react to bursts. If you've ever run into a player who you can't seem to kill but they tap you in a few seconds, this is because they're correctly adapting to you, but you are not adapting to them. A skilled player will separate their offensives and defensives, stacking their back bar with mitigations, protections, and healing, and their front bar will be all damage buffs and abilities. In order to defeat a skilled player, you're going to need as much aggression as you can to overpower their defensives, for if you do not fully commit to the kill, the difficulty of achieving the kill is directly proportional to the player's skill. That being, the more skilled they are, the harder they are to fight. In short, to create the most optimal version of your build, don't use defensive on the front bar, but if you're using an ice staff on the back bar, this is a very good option. If you're using sword and shield, instead of just throwing on defending, you should also consider Nirnhoned powered and decisive as well, but each of those are build dependent. Defending is a solid trait if you're unable to pick a direction or want a general boost to your mitigations. Sharpened is the opposite of defending, and thus operates in a contrasting form. On a two-handed weapon, we receive penetration equal to that of the defending trait, being around a 5% DPS gain, but this part is conditional. Historically, penetration is the fastest path to damage and is a fierce competitor to the critical damage stacking we see present in Update 46. To determine if this outweighs a damage bonus from one of the other options, you'll have to properly assess a few factors, including critical damage and other additions to raw damage increases, such as bonuses to spell power. Note that some choices may ignore the need to stack heavily into penetration, such as relying on abilities or glyphs that deal oblivion damage, or using onslaught or corrosive as part of your burst combo. To clear up some confusion about damage, bleed damage used to bypass resistances, but this is no longer the case. As I mentioned, penetration will always be one of the fastest paths to damage, so Sharpened is a relatively strong and versatile option, just like its counterpart, Defending. Unlike Decisive, which increases the frequency of the offensive windows, Sharpened strengthens the potency of your bursts, but will not extend it, unlike Nirnhoned. That said, if you wish to overpressure your opponents and aim for the highest damage, Sharpened will, in most cases, be the best option. If your playstyle is more brawler-oriented, however, requiring a fair amount of defensives to extend your offensive window, Sharpened may not be the best choice, but as with anything, this requires the context of a build. In short, for builds wanting to deal the most damage as possible and are not using abilities or damage that bypasses resistances like Oblivion, Sharpened is an easy default for most players to use. Infused is a trait that increases the effectiveness and reduces the cooldown of your weapon glyph. In PvE, we use this on our back bar weapon, paired with a dot weapon ability like Blockade or Charge, to keep up our back bar enchantment active as much as possible. That said, because PvP is a subjective matter and constantly evolving field, Infused lends itself to being used in far more creative ways. For those unaware, damage glyphs, such as Shock, Disease, Flame, and so on, have a 4-second cooldown, and buff glyphs, like Berserker, have a 10-second cooldown. With Infused, however, these cooldowns are halved, meaning damage can quickly skyrocket if the build is optimized around the Infused glyph. To emphasize this last part, this trait can be so strong, builds can be centered around it just like Charged. Any strong build will carry many tools in their kit in the form of buffs, but also debuffs, and Infused allows an enchantment to be transformed from an additional boon to a staple of the build. Infused requires the user to carefully consider the status effects associated with the enchantment, or if one isn't present, the synergy between the enchantment and the build. To explain, we can use the Disease enchantment as an example. By placing Diseased and Infused together, paired with any weapon ability, we can have 100% uptime on Minor Defile, reducing our opponent's healing by 8%. The same logic is applied to other damage's status effects, and for a buff glyph like Berserker, grant 348 spell damage on a high uptime, accounting for periods where reactivation may not be possible. The use of Infused, however, cannot be installed without a clear plan in mind. Because of how scaling works with weapon glyphs, Infused is only truly useful on two-handed weapons. While achieving more uptimes on a variety of debuffs is possible with dual wield, the other traits simply beat them in their respective categories. To optimize Infused, you must be using a two-handed weapon spammable ability, such as Force Pulse or Wrecking Blow, and dots from these skill lines like Destructive Clench or Carve will continuously activate your damage, and is certainly the optimal choice if using a buff glyph, but in PvP, focused windows of damage are more important than average damage, excluding dot setups. Because we use spammables to set up burst windows, activating the glyph during this time will further pressure our opponent and damage will line up simultaneously, adding immense burst that was otherwise unseen from a setup. If the damage glyph was activated on a dot ability, however, our burst would be staggered, which is less effective against skilled players. To summarize, Infused, this is a trait often left underrated by the community. And if you're using a two-handed weapon spammable, I highly recommend you at least try this in your build, especially with any damaging glyph. The enchantment that works best for you highly depends on your subclass skill lines, like Sorcerers benefiting from shock damage, and Ardent Flame granting more poison and fire damage. Given that health pools have increased, Oblivion damage may be exceptionally strong in this patch as well, but I cannot personally attest to this claim. Try this out and please let me know. Nirnhoned is a trait that increases the weapon damage by 15%, but I've communicated with many players who misunderstands what this means. On your screen, I've attached the calculation to weapon damage. The first variable included, that being item.weapon damage, is modified by this value, rather than the result adding an additional 15%. While this may be disappointing to some players, one could equate this to about 200 weapon and spell damage. The additional damage may push one to assume this is an offensive trait, but this is truly a hybrid choice that is unique from the others. While every other trait is only active on one bar, Nirnhoned can actually kind of be active on 2 bars. Your healing is based on the higher of your damage types, and HOTS are calculated when cast. If I were to run Powered on the back bar, my Vigor would heal its regular value plus 8%. If I, however, cast Vigor on the back bar with a Nirnhoned weapon, when I swap back, I retain the value of Nirnhoned, thus my heals are increased. While this value is often less powerful than Powered, given how healing received stacks, Nirnhoned offers versatility, and this versatility translates to extended offensive windows. With stronger HOTS ticking when we plan on going offensive, our health pool will remain higher for longer, allowing us to continuously pressure our opponents. While Nirnhoned doesn't offer as much offensive capability as Sharpened, and not as much healing as Powered, we benefit from its effects far more often than either, so if this ideal appeals to you, consider running this on your back bar. From an offensive perspective, however, we can go further. Builds that scale with weapon damage and spell damage, such as those using Sea Serpent's Coil, Olorime, and so on, would be remiss not to include Nirnhoned within their setup. If your build has access to guaranteed paths of damage, such as 100% critical chance with Acuity, or 100% penetration with Onslaught or Corrosive, Nirnhoned adds a lot of damage, and I personally use this within my Update 45 Templar build, linked in the description. If you're unsure of which direction to take your build, and would like a true middle ground of offensive defense, Nirnhoned is a solid choice that I've personally employed. For builds with a specific damage path, however, there may be stronger options that you should consider. Powered is a trait that increases your healing done while that bar is active. This is best used on builds with other bonuses to healing, such as Restoring Light, and allows you to swap off the back bar faster by allowing you to reach maximum hit points more quickly. Importantly, this does not extend your offensive window, nor does it increase its strength, but rather helps you recover from bursts to attempt your window. Moreover, whereas defensive will prevent your hit points from reaching a fatal or execute range, Powered will help you exit this and enter safer thresholds of health more often. especially when paired with abilities like rapid regeneration that scale higher with lower hit points. To make the most out of Powered, you're going to need higher defensives. As covered in my one-shot video, healing and armor serve no purpose without each other. Interestingly enough, the calculation for healing done is purely additive, meaning there are no diminishing returns for boosting the stat, so Powered is exceptionally strong if built into, and often beats Precise on healer builds. With Subclassing's release, healing is less important than armor within the balance of survivability, and healing cannot be performed if you're already dead. For this reason, Powered fell out of grace in generals builds, but remains useful on supports. This trait isn't useless by any means, but is simply outshined by defending within the current meta. If damage is lowered and time to kill increases, Powered can become one of the strongest options, but that is remain to be seen as of making this video. The final trait to discuss is Precise, and it is a fairly complex trait. The tooltip states that the item gives 70% critical chance on a two-handed weapon and half this per one-handed weapon. The strength of Precise isn't as obvious as other traits and isn't built around like Infused. The inclusion of Precise in a build is more like an ornament than a chandelier, in that we already have a set direction for our setup and this trait will simply add to this. To determine if we're running Precise, we should evaluate our critical damage and all the dependencies that come with that. For example, if you're using a melee weapon, Precise is best used with axes or daggers to further maximize critical damage or chance, and loses value with swords as these do not contribute to this path of damage. Within Subclassing, players are racing to score critical hits and protect themselves from as much damage as possible. Thus, to make effective use from Precise, we must also stack into critical damage. To break down some numbers, players running Rallying Cry have at least 50% critical mitigation, and given our base critical damage is 50%, if we had no investment into crit damage, our criticals would do 0 additional damage. Therefore, in order to make critical chance a useful stat, we should consider running Adric Spear and other critical damage lines, as well as supplying ourselves with buffs like Major and Minor Force and the Fighting Finesse CP. To gather the value your critical hits provide, you can make a simple calculation for yourself. Simply multiply the decimal value of your critical chance by the whole number of your critical damage. For example, if we had 30% chance to deal 70% additional damage, we can multiply 0.3 by 70 to get a 21% damage increase. By doing this, you can determine if you need to invest more into either critical chance or damage, but there is more to it than that. Earlier in the video, I mentioned damage fishing, and now it is the time to discuss it. While the above calculation should be used to determine the average value of damage done, in practice, you're going to want higher critical damage than chance. Because a fight against any good player will take a long time, we're going to be looking for opportunities of luck to critically strike. I know this might seem like a lame concept, but if you often see two players stalemate in a long duel, it's because both of them are always anticipating the other's moves, so to actually defeat the opponent might require a bit of luck. Against most players and in BG situations, crit fishing is not required, and you may gain more mileage out of prioritizing critical chance with Precise daggers. Against other players, Precise axes will give you more of an advantage. I hope this video helped you understand traits better, and that you can better optimize your build. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe to the channel, as like I mentioned earlier, it allows even more players to receive help. In an age where gatekeeping is rampant, I find it vital that more people have easier access to information. As always, thank you for watching, and remember to help someone else without expecting anything in return.